because that's the way they do it every service. So far, I think it's worked out okay. So tonight, we want to say welcome and glad you're here. We're not broadcasting yet, are we, brother? Yeah, please do. Tuesday evening services are canceled just for this week. November 29th, praise and pizza service. December 6th in the evening service, we'll have the Lord's Supper. December 9th will be a business meeting. And there's a crib set up for the Alexander baby. Do we have a name yet for this baby? Still working on it. Okay. So, still working on it. Is going to come be with us soon. S-T-O-I, Stoey. Okay, we call her Stoey. No, S-W, still working on Swoy. All right, Swoy, still working on it. We'll be calling her Still when she gets here. And then Christmas cards are out here. Business meeting, we might think about if you want to send a gift to our missionaries. So that's another item for the agenda for business meeting for the 9th. And that's all the announcements I have. Do we have any prayer requests? Any new ones? All right, then let's go to the Lord in a word of prayer then. tonight. Brother Daniel, would you lead us in prayer, please? Amen. Amen. All right. So we have been looking at the kings of Israel. So I wanted to make a little PowerPoint. And I guess I'll give you 3 guesses. And there's 2 possible answers, so I know you're going to get it. That little black devil up there could mean a good king. It could mean an evil king. And so this is going to be a symbol for an evil king. When you see that, that'll tell you what kind of king that fellow was. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. And what you'll see is a whole bunch of these in Israel's dynasty. I've got a little outline face of an angel with a halo. And that's going to be for the good king. So we'll kind of identify them that way and show you each one. But we want to go back, and I'll review a little bit. We'll go through these slides. And tonight the lesson is on Omri, who was a wicked king. I'll tell you already, one of the worst. You remember in the history of Israel that during the time of Samuel, the people went to Samuel and they said, "Give us a king like the rest of the world has." And Samuel tried to say to them that God is their king. And of course they'd sin, and the Lord would raise up a judge and would deliver them from sin. And then that'd last about 20 years and they'd find themselves backslidden again. And so this cycle kind of went through. It cycled through for years like that, for hundreds of years. We know Samuel was the last judge. And as the last judge, he was also a prophet. And he was a very godly man. So they said, "Give us a king." So Samuel went to the Lord, and the Lord said that he would give them a king, and God chose Saul to be the king. And King Saul had a lot of trouble with self-will. In fact, we might say about him is he was like a wild horse that had never been broken. He'd never come under the control of the Lord in his life. He was disobedient to God. And because of his disobedience, God told him, "I'm going to take the kingdom out of your hand, and I'm going to give the kingdom to somebody who will obey me." And you remember how Samuel, how he anointed David to be the king in Saul's place. And years passed before Saul died on the battlefield. For years, David had to hide from Saul and was hunted by Saul. And Saul wanted to do away with David. Now, Saul in his heart knew that it was God's will for David to be king, but we see Saul over and over again fighting against God. So finally he is killed on the battlefield, a battle with the Philistines, and he is actually killed by a passerby who was an Amalekite. And what's interesting about that story is the reason God took the kingdom away from Saul is he told him, he said, "The Amalekites are the enemy of my people." He said, "Saul, I want you to destroy them. Don't leave any of them alive. Don't leave their cattle alive. Don't leave their sheep alive. Listen, if you don't believe God can be a God of judgment, just read over those scriptures. He can be. And He is. He's love, but He's also holy. And so God told him to destroy the Amalekites. And Saul didn't do that. He kept Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and he kept some of the best sheep and cattle for sacrifices, and he brought that back. And then Samuel confronted him, and Saul tried to weasel out of it and say, well, the people wanted to bring these sheep back for sacrifice. And Samuel said, is it better to sacrifice or is it better to obey the Lord? And he had disobeyed the Lord. So God rejected him for being king. And it's interesting that the thing that he rebelled against God over, the killing of the Amalekites, it's interesting that an Amalekite took his life. So the lesson there is the sin that we let go in our lives may be the very thing that does us in the end. We can make that application. So after Saul was killed, David became king. But for 7 years, he was not the king of all of Israel. He reigned in Hebron for 7 years. And there was a conflict, a war over whether the descendants of Saul would be king and of the northern tribes, and the general up there was Abner. He was the commander of the host there. And in David's kingdom, it was his cousin Joab who was the captain of the host. And so there was war, and finally it wound up that Abner got so put out with the descendant of Saul that he said, I'm going to David. When he did that, of course, that pretty much ended the battle over who was going to be king. So David became the king over all 12 tribes. So for 7 years, he was the king only of Judah. And after 7 years, the kingdom was united under David. And he reigned in Jerusalem, the city of David, for 33 years. So David reigned for a total of 40 years. And David is the standard by which all other kings are judged. When God has a comment to make about a king, it's either he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, as did David his father, or he did not that which was right in the sight of the Lord, as did David his father. And so after then, David, we know, died after 40 years of being a king, and Solomon became the king. And Solomon reigned for 40 years. And Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived, but evidently he wasn't wise enough to have self-discipline. He did not discipline himself. He pampered himself. He indulged his passions. He didn't have any wars. He didn't have any battles to fight. David had already won all of them. So the 40 years of Solomon was a time of peace. The nations that David conquered were sending in tribute money. And so it was a very prosperous time for the United Kingdom of Israel. They were rolling in money. And so Solomon built the temple using the materials that David had laid by, and he financed his kingdom with all of this money coming in as tribute money. And he had 300 wives, 700 concubines. He made a lot of treaties with countries around him. In other words, he would take a royal maiden to be his wife, and that would kind of establish a treaty with these other countries around, and there weren't 300 countries around, but he had lots of wives, and that wasn't enough. He had 700 concubines, and he just showered himself with riches. He had, things shipped in. He had apes. He had peacocks. He had all kinds of exotic animals. Everything his heart wanted, he indulged himself. And so this is Solomon. During his reign, the taxes were very heavy because of his lifestyle. And, people in his government, they were living high on the hog, if you will. So when he died, his son Rehoboam became king, and the elders of the 10 northern tribes came down and said to Rehoboam, listen, if you'll just lighten up on us a little bit and take some of these taxes off of us, we will serve you. And so, as it turns out, he didn't do that. So under Rehoboam, the kingdom divided. And they split up. So you had the 10 northern tribes, and you had 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin and Levi. Okay, I'm just kind of reviewing. I've gone over all this before. I don't mean to bore you with it. But the kingdoms of Israel and Judah had what is called dynasties. And a dynasty was a succession of kings in one family. There were many dynasties in Israel. It's characterized by intrigue, by death. One general would kill off the king and then go kill all his family, and he'd declare himself to be king. So tonight we want to look at these. On this first slide you have the first dynasty, which is Jeroboam. God gave the 10 northern tribes to Jeroboam, and he said, if you will just obey me, he said, I'll establish your kingdom. Jeroboam did not believe God. Instead of the kingdom being established for Jeroboam, Jeroboam decided, he got to thinking, if I let all of my people go down to Jerusalem to worship at the temple like the Lord tells us we ought to, then they're going to get homesick. They're going to want to go back and join with the nation of Judah and come back under the rule of the son of David. And so, instead of believing God, what he did then was he set up 2 golden calves. He set up one in Dan and one in Bethel. And he told Israel, he said, it's just too hard for you to go all the way to Jerusalem. You don't need to travel that far. Look, I've set things up where you can worship. Behold the gods that brought you out of Egypt. And he made it convenient for them. They could go to Dan or they could go to Bethel. If you lived in the northern part, go to Dan. If you lived in the central or southern part of Israel, go to Bethel and worship the golden calf. And I want to tell you, God got really upset at him for that, because he had led his people into idolatry. So Jeroboam was an evil king. He reigned about 21 years in the north. And he had a son by the name of Nadab. And Nadab only reigned about a year or so. And Nadab was killed by his general. It was a military coup, a military overthrow. And so even though he only reigned from 909 to 908, and by the way, just so you probably already know this, but when it's BC, the bigger the number is, the earlier in time it is. In other words, as the years passed, they got smaller instead of bigger, like they do now. This is 2020, and we'll never forget it. Next year will be 2021. But in BC, the years got smaller. So it was 909 first, and then the next year would be 908, and then 907 and 906. So he only reigned 1 year, but he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. So now Israel is 2 for 2 with evil kings. Kings that were given to idolatry. And Nadab really just carried on his father's program of leading the children of Israel into idolatry. Okay, so next slide, brother. Okay, so the second dynasty begins with Baasha, the general. He's the guy that killed off Nadab. And so now we've got a new dynasty. And so he reigned from 908 to 886, which would be about 14 and about 21 years or so. He was the king over Israel. He is a wicked king. He kept right on with the policies of Jeroboam. He kept the golden calves. He kept the idolatry going. He was actually a wicked king. Now God had cut off Nadab, but Baasha went and killed him, and he didn't kill him in order to serve God. He killed him in order to get the kingdom. All right, so in 886 BC he died, and his son Elah became king, and he was king from 886 to 885. Now I want you to notice, do you see the pattern? The fathers would be pretty strong kings, even though they were wicked. And as soon as they died, and their sons, the last two dynasties, the king's son would become king, and he'd get killed. Some general would kill him and take over the kingdom. And so Elah was actually killed by one of his generals by the name of Zimri. And so in 885, he killed him. So this is the end of the second dynasty. You had the dynasty of Jeroboam, and now the dynasty of Baasha, which is the second dynasty, and it's over with. You can compare that to the kingdom of Judah, and the kingdom of Judah had only one dynasty from beginning to end, and that is the lineage of David. Okay? So one dynasty compared to all of these short dynasties. And so notice now we've talked about 4 kings, and we are 4 for 4 in being evil. 4 evil kings in a row. Okay, brother, next slide. So Zimri was only king for a week. 7 days, that's it. He was king long enough to kill everybody that was a relative of Baasha. Killed them off. Got rid of them. He got that done in a week. And he was ruling in Tirzah, which was the capital then of the northern kingdom. Now Tirzah was a city that was very hard to defend. And so it was easy to attack. It was easy to defeat that city. So he reigned 7 days in Tirzah, and then another general, Zimri was a general, and so was Omri. And so the military said, we want Omri to be king. And so he went to Tirzah and he attacked it. And Zimri saw that he was going to be defeated and overthrown and probably killed. And so he went into the king's palace and set it on fire and burned it down on top of him. So he died in that palace fire after being king for only 7 days. All right, next slide, brother. Oh, let me say this before we get off of this one. Go back to that one again, okay? go back again. One more. Okay, go to the second slide now. Third slide's the one I want, the one right after this one. Okay, he ruled 7 days. He burned the palace down around him. So the people in Tirzah said, we want Zibni to be the king. So they set up Zibni to be the king in Tirzah, but the army said, we want Omri to be the king. And so you have the people who were living in the capital who said, our king is going to be Zimri. And you had the military out there that said, no, he's not going to be king, but Omri is going to be the king. So now, next one, brother. So Tibni lived about 4 years, and he lived in Tirzah, and there was a struggle over who was going to be king. There was a war that lasted for 4 years. And Omri and Tibni were fighting over, what was going to happen. Now you say, well, why was he able to hold out for 4 years? Probably because when Omri attacked Tirzah, it was a surprise. They didn't expect their own army to come in and kill everybody. So they got in the gate, they got in the city, and so the king burned the palace up around him. So the people of the city said, no, we want Tibni to be the king. And the army said, no, we want Omri to be the king. And so there was a 4-year struggle. Finally, Tibni died, and Omri became king. Now, I want you to guess something before we change it. Do you think Omri was a good king or an evil king? Taking a survey. How many? Evil? We got the thumbs down. All right, let's see the next slide. Oh, surprise, surprise. He was wicked. In fact, he did 2 things. He moved the capital of Israel from Tirzah to Samaria. He bought a big hill, and he named it after the fellow that he bought it from, and Samaria is a form of his name. But Omri said, man, this Tirzah is just too easy to fight against. I'm going to move this capital. And so he bought this big hill, and there was a lot of acreage up on top of this high hill. And so he went up there and he built a city. Now, to understand what's going on here, you know how you would attack a city. If people were inside a city, the only way you could get in a walled city was to stand up ladders, climb up the ladder and get over the wall. Or you could try to break the gate in. And they built these old cities with kind of an L-shaped wall that came out around the gate. And so to get through the gate, you had to go into kind of a portico, an open top, kind of L-shaped. So they'd have to turn the corner and then come into the gate. Well, people up on top of the wall would be shooting them with arrows. They'd be throwing rocks on them. They'd be pouring pots of scalding hot olive oil on them. And it was so that's how you took a city. You just had to kind of tough it out, and you lost a lot of people taking a city. And so Omri said, I'm going to make this even harder. So he goes up on the top of this big hill, and he, on this high hill, hundreds of feet high, steep-sided hill, and he builds the wall out on the edge of the hill, making it really hard to stand up a ladder, making it really hard to get into the city with a battering ram. And so he moved that capital. That's one thing he did. So that's what he's known for. He bought the hill of Samaria and then relocated the capital. But the thing about him is this. He was more evil. The Bible says he was more evil than any king that came before him. He is the worst. Another survey. How many of you think he was the worst one they ever had? Yes, or you think so? Do you think he was? No, he wasn't, because his son topped Daddy. His son, Ahab. Man, what a wicked dude he was. And he had a terrible, wicked wife that helped him be wicked. Her name was Jezebel. So Omri then is the father of Ahab. And I think that's the last slide. This is the beginning of the third dynasty in Israel. And Omri is the king. Now, we find our lesson. And I guess I've burned a lot of minutes here. But does it make sense to go back? Everybody kind of got a good idea of what is going on? All right, so 1 Kings 16 and 20. Now the rest of the acts of Zimri and his treason that he wrought, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So 1 Kings 16, 20 and 21. Then were the people of Israel divided into two parts. Half of the people followed Tibni the son of Ginath to make him king, and half followed Omri. That was that 4-year war I was talking about. But the people that followed Omri prevailed against the people that followed Tibni the son of Ginath. So Tibni died and Omri reigned. In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, began Omri to reign over Israel. 12 years. 6 years he reigned in Tirzah. So he reigned 6 years in Tirzah and 6 years in Samaria. And he bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer. So the guy that owned it was Shemer, and he named it after him, calling it Samaria. And he bought it for 2 talents of silver, and built on the hill, and called the name of the city which he built after the name of Shemer, owner of the hill, Samaria. But Omri wrought evil in the sight of the Lord, and did worse than all that were before him. For he walked in all the way of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and in his sin wherewith he made Israel to sin, to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger with their vanities. Now the rest of the acts of Omri which he did, and his might that he showed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So Omri slept with his fathers and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab his son reigned in his stead. Okay, so some things about Omri. Smith said that his name means pupil of Jehovah. Wow. I don't think he was very aptly named. If he learned anything from Jehovah, he learned that it does not pay to sin, and it does not pay to lead God's children into sin. He walked in all the ways of Jeroboam. Bethel became the center for the worship of the golden calf, and just to make things easier, they worshipped it up in Dan as well. And everything he did was in the way of Jeroboam the king. He allowed his son Ahab, to be married to the daughter of the Sidonian king. So here again we talked about how you make treaties with folks. You can sign a piece of paper, or you can marry into the family. And of course, marrying into the family made a stronger bond than just an agreement. You know, because you had your wife came from these people, and you know, so the idea was if you exchange wives, then you've got a great treaty. This was the downfall, you remember, of Solomon. So Omri gained control over the northern part of Moab. He was a warrior, he was a general, and he whipped Moab. Now Moab was down, it was back to the east of Israel and back to the south. and he went in and defeated them. Have any of you ever heard of the Moabite stone? The Moabite stone was an ancient writing where it was carved into the stone. They discovered this stone, and in the Moabite stone it tells about Omri and how cruel and vicious he was, and how he brought the country of Moab under subjection and under tribute. So that was basically his accomplishments. He was condemned by the prophet Micah. I'll read this to you, Micah chapter 6, verse 13. Therefore also will I make thee sick in smiting thee, in making thee desolate because of thy sins. Thou shalt eat but not be satisfied, and thy casting down shall be in the midst of thee, and thou shalt take hold, but shalt not deliver. And that which thou deliverest will I give up to the sword. Thou shalt sow, but thou shalt not reap. Thou shalt tread the olives, but thou shalt not anoint thee with oil, and sweet wine, but thou shalt not drink wine. For the statutes of Omri are kept, and all the works of the house of Ahab. And ye walk in their counsels, that I should make thee a desolation, and the inhabitants thereof a hissing. Therefore ye shall bear the reproach of my people. So what was he telling Israel later on? As time went on, and the Lord was getting ready to destroy them, what did he charge them with? But walking according to the statutes of Omri. So this guy is a bad king. And these people were living for themselves. They didn't care about the kingdom. They didn't care about the Lord. They cared about their power. Does that sound familiar? Human nature. We see it on display around us in America today. We still have people in our country that are like these wicked kings that want to be in charge. And they want to rule, and they don't care. And so there we are. Okay, all right, you can turn it off now, brother.